Alors, bonjour et bienvenue au laboratoire de cyberjustice. Good afternoon and welcome to this interdisciplinary conference, The Past, Present and Future of European Democracy. It's a pleasure to welcome two leading scholars in the field of European law and political economy, Professor of International Relations and Political Science, Vivien Schmidt from Boston University, and Professor of Law, Michael Wilkinson from the London School of Economics. This conference is a second part of a two-day academic event on European economic governance that I have organized with Thibault Biscahie at the Centre de Recherche en Droit Public. Yesterday, we had the great pleasure of holding at the Faculté an international workshop entitled Rule and Laws of European Economic Governance, a meeting with talented early career researchers from Belgian, English, Scottish, Italian, and French institutions. Under the aegis of Vivien and Michael, we have witnessed social science in the making with high-quality paper presentations from our participants, followed by very stimulating discussions. Today, we'll be reflecting on Vivien and Michael's last book, two important contributions to European integration studies published at the turn of the 2020s. Since the publication of this penetrating analysis on European economic governance, the European Union has experienced additional shock, including the COVID-19 pandemics and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, the EU is once more at a juncture, an electoral one this time, with the European parliamentary election coming up in a bit more than 2 weeks, and we'll see certainly a wave of extreme right radicals, let's say. We'll see, hopefully not. In sum, the context seems to fit to adopt a longer view on the EU and to discuss the history of European economic governance, avoid the pitfalls of cliché and histoire inventée of the European project, take a good look at the gradual transformation of its mechanism, rules, and laws, and assess the ways in which these rules and laws were applied and contested by key political actors in different historical periods. In examining these issues, Vivien and Mike will also reflect on the future of economic decision-making in the European Union. Vivien Schmidt is a Professor Emerita of International Relations and Political Science, Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration, and founding director of the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University. Her latest book is Europe, Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone at Oxford University Press in 2020, book that received the Best Book Award from the American Political Science Association's Ideas Knowledge Political section in 2021. Michael Wilkinson is a professor at the London School of Economics at Department of Law. He works in the areas of constitutional theory, European integration, and legal, political, and social theory. His book on authoritarian liberalism and the transformation of modern Europe, published in 2021, was selected as one of the key books of the year on the future of Europe by the Review of Democracy. He recently co-edited a collection on a new approach to the study of constitutional law, the Cambridge Handbook on the Material Constitution, that I've ordered, by the way, so I look forward to it. And Vivien and Mike will each deliver a keynote for about 15 minutes, and they will then engage in a discussion moderated by Thibault for 30 minutes. And after that, they will engage in a Q&A with all of you. Thank you very much. Good conference.
So delighted to be here. Thank you, Karim. Thank you, Thibault, for this lovely welcome. Thank you, members of yesterday's workshop, for wonderful papers and great discussion. So I'm hopeful that I can just continue our discussion of yesterday. And so what I'm going to be talking today about is sort of moving forward from my book, giving you some sense of how I define legitimacy, and then moving on to look at the EU's many crises. And if we think about these crises, we can go back to the crisis of democratic governance, beginning with the EU Constitutional Treaty in 2005, the Lisbon Treaty 2009, the rise of various populisms, in particular beginning in the 2010s and intensifying in recent years. And there was a political economic crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and that's really what I'm going to be focusing on, economic governance. But beyond that, we can talk about the sociocultural crisis, involving migration, for example, starting in 2015, the integration crisis, as in European integration, with Brexit in 2016, health crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, security and defense, the Ukraine war with Russia, beginning in 2022, and needless to say, there's still the environmental crisis that's been ongoing, climate change, which we're probably feeling already today, or still today. So anyway, future of basically, I'm going to be talking about the future, but first, I'd like to define democratic legitimacy. And how does one define democratic legitimacy? Often, legitimacy is seen is talked about in Weberian terms as public consent to a governing authority, trust in a governing authority. But importantly, how do you ensure trust in a governing authority? Reinforce that trust or public consent? It's through governments or governing authorities, governing activities. And so here, in EU studies terms, there's long been a discussion of output versus input legitimacy, or policy effectiveness and performance on the output side, political responsiveness of governments, and citizen participation on the input side. And what I do in my book, but what I've done in articles previously, I've talked about the fact that there's another governing activity that's tremendously important in terms of legitimacy, and that's the procedural legitimacy. And that's things like accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness. And in much of the literature on legitimacy, they've sort of been scattered across the stage, whereas people talk about performance or they talk about participation, but they rarely talk about the procedures in the same way. And so what I tried to do is say, you need to take account of all three kinds of categories of governing activities in order to recognize how they interact. There may be trade-offs between input and output legitimacy. You've got good performance, so it doesn't matter that the governing authorities didn't consult the public, or the public voted for something pretty stupid, but it's legitimate. They voted for it. It doesn't work. It's still legitimate. There's often a problem in the assumption that, well, if you have good procedures, you're accountable, transparent, it means it makes up for performance or for lack of participation. It doesn't. Throughput, procedural legitimacy, when it's good, it's kind of invisible. It allows citizens to say, we want this, and end up with good performance by officials who are accountable and transparent, etc. But if the officials seem oppressive, biased, incompetent, then that taints the output and that skews the input. So I think it's tremendously important to talk about these relationships. And then finally, I think the big question is that one wants to ask about the EU: is the EU itself democratically legitimate as a governing authority? Well, one could argue yes, to the extent that the member states have agreed through policy area after policy area to this or that, seeing it as legitimate. So one could say that in some sense, yes, it's democratically legitimate as a governing authority. As a democracy, well, it's not a democracy in the traditional sense, but its member states are democratic. It follows democratic principles, or at least it claims so. But is it then democratically legitimate in terms of governing authority? And there I have to say, governing activity. And there I have to say, it depends. And it depends about what we're talking, about the kinds of activities involved. And as we'll see, real problems with the Eurozone crisis. But before we get there, one extra complication, and that is, how do we talk about legitimacy or even democratic legitimacy in the context of the European Union, a supranational entity? And here we have to think about it as split level legitimacy. At the EU level, you get a focus on policies that work, output performance, and procedures, accountability, transparency. The Commission always talks about that. So at the EU level, output and input, and at the national level, you've got politics, you've got input legitimacy. After all, that's where governments are elected, and they are then in the council as member state leaders, ministers, etc., or they're in the parliament, etc. So mainly national level input politics, with the exception of, say, the European Parliament, which is directly elected. So what happens in terms of politics then in the EU? And what we've seen over time, from a beginning where it looked like the permissive consensus, no one was worried about the EU, or allegedly so, what we see is increasing politicization. At the bottom, what you see is growing Euroscepticism, the rise of populism. From the bottom up, we see an increasingly constraining dissensus, in particular in the Council, as it responds to national levels of politicization, Euroscepticism, extremes on the right and the left. And then also at the top, where there's a kind of new politicized dynamics of interaction. But I guess the question here, and the assumption, and lots of the literature talks about all of this as if it's very negative in terms of politicization. And my question would be, is it only negative politicization? And here, people have written about, scholars have written about a destructive dissensus regarding the Eurozone crisis or the migration crisis. But maybe we could also talk about positive politicization and empowering dissensus or even consensus. Think of COVID-19 and the response there, which was much more positive. Also think about the kind of response to the Ukraine war, where the member states have been together on this, along with the Commission. So important to see different ways in which we can talk about legitimacy. So moving on then, what about legitimacy during crises? And here, there's actually a lot of literature, and this is in the sort of the legal field as well, and the constitutional scholars talk about crises and emergency politics. And in emergencies, of course, what you have is governing authorities suspend input politics and throughput procedures, i.e. they say, okay, Parliament can't meet because it's too dangerous, say COVID, or there's no time and to consult the public, or in terms of accountability, transparency, you've got to get it done quickly. And this is all, you suspend the input and throughput in the interest of performance, of output performance. This is what's often called the proportionality principle as well. But then the question becomes, what happens when the emergency is over? Do these emergency politics continue? And you don't go back to having parliaments come in or remain non-transparent, or does something else happen? And what happens when the emergency is the question becomes, are these emergency politics legitimized and normalized, i.e. are they ratcheted up, or are they delegitimized and rolled back? And what I'm going to argue, or what I do argue, in more recent work, is that if you look at the Eurozone crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, with the austerity rules of the Stability and Growth Pact during the COVID-19 crisis, what we saw is the Council and the Commission rolled back the measures that were voted in haste in emergency politics from 2010 to 2012, and then they suspended them during the next emergency, which was COVID. In contrast, so that suggests that maybe it was delegitimized what they had done, versus the European Central Bank ratcheted up monetary policy on a regular basis, 2012, 2015, and even more with COVID. So here's another way of thinking about legitimacy during crises. And now what I want to do is do a deeper dive into how you think, how one can talk about legitimacy during the Eurozone crisis. So more quickly now, what was Europe's Euro crisis of legitimacy about? Well, what they did was it was governing by rules and ruling by numbers. So if you want throughput, an attempt at throughput legitimacy, but that didn't work. There was poor economic performance, poor output, leading to increasingly toxic politics, as we saw the rise of the extremes and increasing contestation and politicization in response to the kinds of policies that governing by rules and ruling by numbers that were seen also as lacking accountability, transparency, and the rest. So what happens in the initial phase, from crisis government 2012 to 2010 to 2012, we get austerity and structural reforms. And here, and most of you probably know the story, but there was a misframing of the crisis as one of public debt, a misdiagnosis of bad behavior. The result was the wrong remedies, harsh austerity and structural reform, in particular for program countries. And there were no real solutions. The crisis went on and on. The markets continued to attack one country after another, contagion effects, et cetera. And on top of this, the European semester was created, and it was all sticks and no carrots. Do this, do that, other rapid fiscal consolidation and the rest. But what happens after 2 years? It seems to me that what governing authorities recognized is that governing bodies were recognizing that they were losing their authority. Public consent, loss of public trust. You can see it in all the various Eurobarometer polls. And starting in 2012, what you get is a reinterpretation of the rules. 2012 to 2015, there's a reinterpretation of the rules. However, by stealth, they don't say it. You get a continued discourse of of austerity and structural reform at the same time that you see the Commission changing its policies, changing the way in which it's interpreting the rules. It's reinterpreting the rules by stealth, by not admitting to it, but they do it. That's the Commission recalibrating also the numbers. The European Central Bank reinterprets its mandate, slowly but surely, but saying, oh, this is in our mandate. It's the famous moment in 2012 when Mario Draghi says, I'll do whatever it takes to save the euro. And the markets stop their attacks. And then what you see is continuing expansive monetary policy, where it starts out from Trichet saying, we can't do much of anything. This is our mandate. And then Draghi changes it here, here, here. And each time, as they make it more and more expansive, they say, this is our mandate. It's great. Reinterpretation of the rules, but kind of hide it in plain view. And the council also changes its discourse. It goes from a stability, it's all about stability, this is Merkel, to, well, okay, growth with stability. And then 2014, flexibility within the stability rules. And then by 2015, what you get is a recognition you need investment, growth returns. The Commission admits its flexibility now, but the damage is already done. The suboptimal rules remain. It's still governing by rules and ruling by numbers, even if they're being made more flexible and softer. And populist anti-system challengers are very much on the rise. So I know I've been going a bit more slowly than I should have. So just to give you a sense of the EU actors, because when we talk about legitimacy, how do you actually, and I was confronted with this, how do I talk about legitimacy? I know they were wrong, but how do you make it appear as if no? How does one assess the legitimacy of actors, recognizing that different actors have different views of what's legitimate? And so for the council, my question was it a dictator led by Germany or a mutually accountable deliberative body? Actually, you can make both arguments. Germany was basically saying, we won't do this. We don't want to have to, bail out all of these countries until they do. But in exchange, there has to be massive conditionality. But at the same time, all of the various EU institutions, all the member states agreed to this. So deliberation. The only thing is, for the program countries, this was not. This was much more harsh dictatorship, if you think about Greece, or possibly deliberative authoritarianism. Portugal talked about it, was able to deliberate about it, but still, these were imposed. What about the ECB? Hero saving the euro, or the ogre forcing countries into programs? Think about Trichet, the ECB president's secret letters to the Greek prime minister, to the Spanish prime minister, saying, you do this or else. Irish prime minister. So hero or ogre. The commission, ayatollahs of austerity. I like that one. Or ministers of moderation. You can make both arguments. Ayatollahs of austerity, certainly in those first couple of years, basically pushing countries to do rapid fiscal consolidation, etc. But at the same time, they were the ones that by 2012 began shifting, saying, oh my God, this isn't working, and became increasingly flexible. So ministers of moderation. And then, of course, the European Parliament. Where is it? Actually, almost nowhere. So the question is, was it a talking shop with no size at all, or a potential equal partner? But because what you saw over the course of the crisis was the European Parliament was consistently coming back in and saying, no, we need to be able to have something to say. What about COVID-19? And what's interesting there is, after a very initial 6 months, 2, 3, 4, depending what you're looking at, it looks like the Eurozone crisis all over again, but then it changes. EU governing authority becomes more input legitimate, citizen trust increases, and what happens is that the council now becomes a mutually accountable deliberative body without the diktats. The ECB looks more like a hero without the ogre-like qualities. The Commission, ministers of moderation without the Ayatollah-like aspects. You know, it suspends the deficit and the debt rules, it suspends state aid rules, creates SURE. And what about the EP? More of an equal partner, or still a talking shop? Actually doesn't have much to do until the budget discussions, at which point it really picks up. It reinstates the rule of law proviso that had been taken out of or diminished in the treaty acceptance and all the rest. But what about, wrapping up now, what about today? And there was tremendous hope with the COVID-19, because it's not only did it suspend the rules, but it created the next generation EU with the push toward which the group with lots of money in the RRF. I know you love acronyms. In the Resilience and Recovery Fund, was it upwards of 800 billion euros for the green transition, digital transformation, and addressing social inequalities. And so tremendous hope that there would be a new permanent EU level debt, and that the rules would remain suspended, that you just get rid of the rules. Yeah, hopefully, you know, great hopes, but not at all. And in fact, what happened was there's been a discussion in the past year over how to reform the rules. Governing by rules and ruling by numbers, however, is back. The Commission was not ambitious in terms of its proposal. I can talk about any of this later. In terms of the Council, the fiscal hawks on deficit and debt were back. And the result is that there was a slight moderation in the rules, but we're really back to a slightly modified 2010 set of rules. More flexible, more focused on individual countries, but similar problems. The reform is a disaster for EU member states' climate and social commitments. There have been any number of studies that suggest it's impossible for member states to meet their climate goals, to meet their social commitments. And of course, no one's talking about how they're going to pay for the Ukraine war in terms of security. And basically, what's going to happen is the impact is going to be very hard on the member states. More negative politicization, more fodder for the populist revolt that will be more focused on anti-climate, pro-Europe of nations, and all the rest. So to conclude, the future of democratic legitimacy in the EU, I suppose I've not painted a very happy picture, but how do we think about that future? One would be, yes, the governing by rules and ruling by numbers have just been reinstated. And that's a real problem. So what do we do for optimal performance? There needs to be permanent EU level bond capability. The ECB needs to become a real lender of last resort. It needs to continue its expansive monetary policy, but go beyond that, perhaps green bonds or any number of other things that have been under discussion. But beyond that, the EU is still not sufficiently democratically legitimate. The Council is still stymied by the unanimity rules and vetoes. The European Parliament needs to have more democratic input into the decision-making in a whole range of areas. And of course, the populist revolt is not over.
Thank you to Thibault. Thank you to Karim for the invitation. I should have a look at my clock to make sure I don't speak for too long. Okay, so Vivien said she's painted a not very happy picture of the state of European democracy. I'm afraid I'm going to paint a far gloomier one even than she did. And maybe put my cards on the table at the beginning and say that there is no future for democracy within the European Union as it's currently configured. A bold statement perhaps, but one which I hope I will persuade you of the truth over the course of the next 15 minutes. I'm going to focus on the past more than the present, and we can only speculate on the future, but on the basis, I hope, of a sounder understanding of the past. And I'm going to focus on the past in terms of the longue durée of European constitutional history. As I do in my book, I'm beginning with the interwar period between the First and Second World War, which I believe is essential to understand the current situation, but also the unraveling, the unfolding of Europe in the decades since the post-war era. And I'll say a little bit more, I think, in the Q&A about my approach, the method. So I won't linger on that, but at this point, but rather just begin with my narrative. And to understand post-war Europe, one has to understand the long 19th century from the French Revolution into the First World War, which reveals this march of the masses onto the stage of history, as Eric Hobsbawm puts it, the struggle for universal suffrage, the struggle for workers' rights, for women's rights, for various forms of political equality, which reached this crescendo in the interwar era, with the rise not only of universal suffrage, but also of mass political parties representing the working class, representing the interests of the subordinate classes, as one might put it in more contemporary language, and that this posed a severe threat to the bourgeoisie, but also to the ruling class more generally, and to the ideology of liberalism itself. And at this point, one can argue about the 19th century. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to go into that if you want me to stop speaking before the end of midnight. So we have to begin the story somewhere, somewhat artificially, but that in this moment of heightened crisis in the interwar period, with the breakdown of liberal democracy, we see this tension emerging between liberalism and democracy. Liberals become fearful of mass democracy, fearful of democracy turning into socialism, not only the revolutionary version that had occurred in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, but also the prospect with universal suffrage that a parliamentary system could turn towards a more social state. And this was a profound problem for the liberal bourgeois bloc, as it was referred to in that era. This led liberals to turn to all sorts of means to attempt to subvert or repress democracy, using the courts, using the powers of the president under the Weimar Constitution to bypass parliament. Of course, there was also, in a context of political violence, of serious extra-parliamentary repression. But this was a bigger story. It was not only in Germany that the situation was a turbulent one. It was across the world. And Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian political economist, presents this era of deep tension between liberalism and democracy as being fatal for democracy, because the way that liberals turned to authoritarian means to repress democracy meant that democracy was weakened in such a way that it could not face the threat of fascism when it arrived. And this is clearly a grave situation, one which Polanyi's lesson was that one must develop a more social state in order to prevent precisely that threat occurring. However, and this is why we have to look at history, Polanyi's story was not the one that became hegemonic after the Second World War. The story instead that became the dominant story was that democracy had collapsed for being overly excited in some form. And so various liberals, including neoliberals, ordo-liberals, and indeed social democrats, a group of, let's say, assorted centrist dads in contemporary terminology, looked at ways of preventing democracy from interfering in the economy. They took the opposite lesson that Polanyi had tried to teach and said that, no, democracy needs to be constrained. Democracy needs to be constrained in order to safeguard the economy. And this ultimately is the way in which post-war Europe was constructed, along lines that we would now talk about as being a mixture of ordo-liberal, neoliberal, and two French social democrats, sorry, well, at least one French social democrat, and Jacques Rueff, who was a free market thinker, but who became central in his work on the European Court of Justice in the 1950s. We can talk a little bit more about these precise figures and their influence perhaps in Q&A. So the birth of neoliberalism was not with Thatcher and Reagan. The birth of neoliberalism was in 1938 at the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. Of course, it took decades to construct itself on this new footing, but it meant a number of features that we can identify broadly under the label of the demobilization of the masses. This elite project to demobilize the masses had a number of features which have been identified, were identified by various critical theorists, some associated with the Frankfurt School, such as Herbert Marcuse, and a push away from class struggle and the abandonment of class struggle also by parties of the left. The German social democrats abandoned class struggle in the late 1950s. The development in this period of what Kirchheimer called the catch-all party, the party that attempted to unite, if you like, the centrist dads under one roof. Christian democracy was extremely influential in this era in terms of both domestically and transnational networks of power, a highly centrist ideology. And along with that, this turn away from politicization towards law, towards technocracy, towards consumerism. Yeah, this is the age of, as Marcuse puts it, one-dimensional man who is obsessed with a sort of instrumental rationality. Yeah. Now, this was identified at the time. This is not something that we can only look at with hindsight. Franz Neumann, another figure on the outer circles of the Frankfurt School in 1953, looking at the scene in Europe from America, says that citizens' alienation from democratic political power was increasing in Europe at a tremendous speed. This is Franz Neumann in 1953. Okay, what does this signify? What does this mean as a matter of constitutional law, which is my own discipline? Well, this turn towards lawyers and experts is built around certain myths which have an impact on Germany in particular, but on Europe as a whole. Myths about hyperinflation leading to democratic collapse. Myths around democratic excess leading to collapse. Whereas the reality was that it was a repression of democracy, which was the proximate cause of Weimar's collapse. Legislative positivism is blamed, and so there's a rebirth of natural law, the complete legalization of constituent power. The power no longer belongs with the people, but is somehow dispersed among counter-majoritarian institutions. This is the court in Germany, this brutal concrete structure, the Karlsruhe court, which we'll say a little bit more about in the Q&A, which constructs its own constitutional authority and acquires a great deal of constitutional legitimacy through this fear of popular sovereignty. We are afraid of the people, as Christoph Mollers puts it in the German context. European integration is an important part of this story, consolidates the power of the legal and juristic class. The ECJ itself constitutionalizes a framework of treaty rights and freedoms which impose significant constraints on the member states, on political possibilities, the political economic possibilities. And I'll skip over this, but because again, we might come back to it in Q&A. But this symbol of law as uniting Europe seems to have a noble cause, but there is a dark side. As Joseph Weiler puts it, political messianism, which he attributes to the founding generation of European gods and fathers, if you like, founding fathers, goes in hand with a self-referential conception of law. In other words, there's a delinkage between law and politics, between law and democratic process, democratic input, if you like, to use Vivien's terminology. So the German case is extremely important and a narrative which is central to my book. But what's important to address is the way that this domestic constitutional system is consolidated and entrenched through a process of European integration. This idea of not just constraining politics through various cultural and political projects, but through an increasingly rigid economic constitutional settlement. And this is at least in the ideas of Joachim Mestmecker, who was a later order liberal in the 1970s, a sort of second generation order liberal, that talks about how planning, economic planning is basically bad, and individual liberties, individual economic liberties need to be protected as a whole from the system of governing. Giandomenico Muglioni, a rather mainstream figure of European integration, identifies this as a key plank of classical liberalism itself, this idea that you can separate politics and economics, a founding assumption of the EEC, and one which we, I think, have discovered is an impossibility. Okay, so what does this mean for the state? What does this mean for the member states of the European Union? Now, clearly there are important national differences. One has to be careful not to generalize. There are at least 3 or 4 varieties of constitutional history which emerge across the various member states. We can identify a kind of core, a post-fascist core, those countries which experienced fascism directly or indirectly, And so it's the founding 6 members, Germany, France, Italy, and the Benelux countries. We can talk about the countries that joined later on, for example, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, which had a more optimistic vision after the dictatorships of thinking about European Union as part of this promised land. And we can talk about the countries of Central and Eastern Europe separately too, which joined much later on, and of course joined after their experience of domination by an outside force, by the Soviet Union. And then there are the continuing democracies, the country of the Scandinavian bloc and the UK, which has a slightly more detached view of their relationship with the European Union. But in each of these cases, Europe constructs what Chris Bickerton calls a hard but hollow state form. Hard because European integration entrenches the power of the elites, entrenches the power of the unelected technocrats. Hollow because it hollows out that relationship between rulers and ruled that is essential for a representative democracy to thrive. So it weakens democracy, it hollows it out, and it does so on the basis, it did so, we should say, on the basis of a rather permissive consensus in the founding decades. And the failure of the left is vital here, but I haven't got time to go into it now. Only to say that the Maastricht era puts both an additional set of layers on top of this system of authoritarian liberalism, but also witnesses the challenge to it. We get at Maastricht both the upscaling of European integration into further areas of the state, monetary policy, and so on. Vivien talked about. Peter Meyer talks about how this void between the people and the elites grows in this era. We have, of course, the expansion of Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but we also, on the right, have challenges to Europe. I've mentioned the Karlsruhe Accord, but we also have anti-systemic political movements beginning to generate. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen, founder of the Front National, which starts to grow in the 1990s. The referendum in France in 1992 on Maastricht, the Petit Oui, should have signaled the discontent beneath the surface. Again, recognized at the time by various commentators, Marcel Gauchet, who talked in 1990 about the social fracture that was growing between because of the inequality between the classes and the distance between the people and the elites. Maastricht was a signal of what should have been evident. Nevertheless, this disconnect continues. European public philosophers, this is Jürgen Habermas, despite diagnosing all the democratic deficits in the EU, continues to see the EU as the only possible way forward, as the stepping stone, in his words, to the constitution of a world society. This is the era of cosmopolitanism, of globalization. But that these ideas are merely aggravating this mismatch between the system that the philosophers and politicians are building and the life world of the people that are experiencing. The upshot is a post-democracy, post-politics that's been diagnosed by many political theorists, of which the third way politics was a good illustration. And now, of course, Macron is the perfect illustration of this form of highly authoritarian technocratic centrism, along with, of course, the use of emergency presidential powers, we should say. Now, the Euro crisis puts a spanner in the works, right? Now, this is important to note, but this is a graph of the 10-year bond yields on government debt. And you can see this extraordinary convergence from the Maastricht Treaty in 1994. These are the rates at which governments are borrowing. You've got Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, which start to converge to the point where when the euro was introduced, these countries are all borrowing at the same rates of interest. Yeah. Greece and Germany are viewed as equally economically credible. The fiction of the market. Yeah. Draghi in 2012 comes up with his whatever it takes speech, and there, well, that's after this graph. This is the point at which it looks like the whole thing is going to fall apart. Yeah, 2010, 2011, the thing looks like it's not going to be sustainable. Greece again starts borrowing at rates of interest which make it virtually impossible to become liquid, and various political devices are attempted, and economic devices attempted to resolve the situation, but effectively just deferring the crisis from one to the next, no real solution. Yeah. Now, why is that the case? And it's of course difficult to offer a simple answer, but I think Roderick's trilemma is a very helpful one to have in mind. So Danny Roderick, who developed this way of understanding globalization, doesn't really apply it to the EU, but I think it can be very nicely applied to the EU. And Roderick's trilemma is essentially to say that you can have two of these three things, but only two. You cannot have national sovereignty, European integration, and democracy at the same time. You have to choose between two of the three. So the current path, effectively, which represses, sidesteps democracy, seems to be unstable, but more or less managing from one crisis to another. You have various projects of democratizing Europe. I mentioned Habermas earlier, the DM movement, which is Varoufakis's attempt to democratize Europe. Idealistically, maybe there is something in that. The reality is, I think that is simply implausible. Therefore, exit, or at least rupture from the current system of the EU will be necessary to restore democracy. I've pretty much run out of time, so I just want to say two things. Well, one is to say, well, how does the system maintain itself? Well, the first thing to note is that going back over the historical record helps to explain how much of this is really entrenched in post-war European history. And yet, the hegemony of the ruling order is a weak one. There isn't a fully legitimate or a fully authoritarian system in place. There are various weak links in the chain, but neither is there possibility of some sort of resolution. Yeah, so this is on the left. We've got the Ochi referendum in Greece in 2015 when the people voted against the memorandum and then were offered an even harsher set of measures which the Greek political class capitulated on. Various attempts at a sort of more centrist imposition of authority. And the reality, I'm afraid, on the right is that of the prospect of an increasingly far-right EU, where the EU is integrating the very thing that it was designed to avoid, which is this anti-systemic political path. So what is the antidote? In a word, the antidote is the repoliticization of the demos through projects of democratic sovereignty, which means you need to have at least a credible case for leaving the EU, and that this is not some sort of national retrenchment, but the recovery of a long progressive philosophy of internationalism, not Eurocentrism. And on that note, I will end. I went a little bit over time. Apologies for that, Thibault. But thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So we're going to open the floor for questions in a little bit from the audience. But before that, I wanted to engage in a little discussion with you, just to go back to your approach to these topics, and also go back to some of the institutions that you focused on in your work. I will start with you, Vivien. You presented the three types of legitimacies that you developed in your book, and you raised this problem of split-level legitimacy. So whereby the EU institutions are concerned with the output and throughput legitimacy, while the national level is mainly concerned with input legitimacy, mostly because the EU lacks the political legitimacy of a directly elected government. So now this tension that you highlight gave rise to what you call politicization, whereby these institutions tend to emancipate themselves from the rules agreed upon, so by stealth, without admitting it. And in concrete terms, that means that they have not been so rigid in the application of the rules. So this begs a few questions. Does this politicization correct some of the problematic flaws of EU governance, especially when it comes to input legitimacy? And in other words, does politicization signal an increased democratization, or could it conversely signal, one might argue, a shift towards greater flexibility, which could be interpreted as a shift towards greater arbitrariness, perhaps, because you do not have this direct citizen input?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, in order to understand the politicization a bit, sort of I want to back up. And in 2006, in my Democracy in Europe book, I talked at the time about, again, a problem of legitimacy and actually democracy by looking at the impact of European integration on its member states. And I do sort of two contrasting cases, France and Britain on the one hand, and Italy and Germany on the other. I don't need to go into that very much, except to say that for both sets of countries, a lot had to do with the way political leaders presented or discussed the discourse. And so just to give you the example of Britain and France, both simple polities where governing authority is channeled through a single governing body. What you saw is that where in France you had political leaders using discourses of identity and sovereignty to talk about the way in which in France the EU is seen as an extension of national sovereignty and identity. In the UK, you saw an opposite kind of discourse, where on the one hand, you had pro-European leaders essentially arguing it's all in our economic interest, and the anti basically saying it's all about national sovereignty and identity. And about 1,000 years of history came from one leader on the left, etc. And the result is we see France remaining in the EU and still trying to claim leadership. I say try to claim leadership because that's actually not working. But the UK breaks it. It leaves the exit. So that's one form we could say of politicization. But what I'm saying here is it's how it's managed at the national level, or the way in which elites explain why European integration makes sense or doesn't. So that's one aspect. But another part, in another area about the politics specifically, in the book, I talk about the fact that at the time, the EU level was basically policy without politics, and the national level was politics without policy. As over time, increasing numbers of policies, in particular in the economic area, went up to the EU level, emptying the national realm of politics, political debate. I mean, exactly as Mike has been saying about the sort of the problems of democracy at the national level, is that political debate is no longer about those issues. Instead, actually, what you see is they move to the more sociocultural, more on immigration, those areas that still remain in the national domain. Interestingly, by 2020, I look back at this formula and say, it actually no longer describes, it no longer reflects what we see. Because at the national level, instead of politics without policy, it's politics against policy. Or even politics against polity in the case of the UK and Brexit. At the EU level, it's increasingly policy with politics. And you see it not only in this kind of bottom-up politicization where member state leaders in the council are more and more concerned about what national publics are saying. So in this way, we could say that there's a kind of democratizing function here. But that kind of response of national leaders, member state leaders, but they're at the same time national leaders, their response to increasing Euroscepticism and politicization at the national level is greater contestation at the EU level. So from the bottom up, what you get is more politicization in the council, national politics increasingly in the discussions of the council, and contestation there, increasing divisions and difficulty in making consensual agreements, or you end up with sort of actually very unfortunate, especially in the case of the Eurozone crisis. What you see is sort of the worst possible responses. But at the same time, it's not just politicization from the bottom up, but it's politicization at the top. And that is that it's not just member state leaders in the council who are politicized, but the commission itself is increasingly political. We think of politicized as a bad term because we think of negative politicization, but you could also argue that it can be positive politicization. And what you see is that when Juncker comes in as commission president, he says, we are a political commission now. So an acknowledgement that we are increasingly political. And he was saying, we actually now need to be more responsive to the people. And that's when you get in, it wasn't very effective, but at least it brings in what Mike described as the problem of social Europe that was abandoned. Well, now you begin to see an attempt to bring it back in with the Pillar of Social Rights in 2017, with a European semester oversight of member states that is not only increasingly flexible, but also says, okay, now you need to deal with the social. You need to consider issues of poverty. I mean, not that the member states do, but at least it's part of the discourse. And so what you see is a shift there. And then COVID hits. And what's interesting there is from the negative politicization that you saw during the Eurozone crisis, in particular in those early years, which was where it was a blame game. I mean, basically, France and Germany wanted to save their banks. So they blamed Greece for bad behavior, which it did. But then they applied conditionality, not just to Greece, but also to all the other countries. And they did it in a way that made it basically impossible for these countries to grow while in these harsh austerity programs of rapid fiscal consolidation and structural reforms in those first years that simply meant crush the unions, cut the welfare state. But what you see starting in 2015, and this is also about the politicization, but in a positive way, is you see a shift. You actually even see it starting in 2012, where they can't really say that they're doing this, where they shift the discourse. And it's no longer crush the unions, it's actually bring in the social partners. Do whatever you can to get labor peace. And by 2015, watch out for the welfare state and all of that. With COVID, what you see is solidarity. What you see is the European semester completely changes from this top-down conditionality. You have to do this. Not the member states do, as I mentioned before, except for the rapid fiscal consolidation that they did. And in those early years, crush the unions, whether it's Portugal or Spain or Greece, and cut pensions, to the bone, especially Greece, but also in other countries in programs. But what you see with COVID is this resilience and recovery fund is actually the money. Where does it go? It goes to those countries that were most negatively affected by the responses to the Eurozone crisis, and also where there's increasing Euroscepticism. So it's political in the sense that, oh my God, we kind of recognize that, well, we're not going to say it, but we're going to give money to those countries that were most negatively affected by what was done during the Eurozone crisis. At the same time, that there's a sense of the difficulties of politics. And then perhaps I should end with this, the issue of populism. And I've been working a lot on that. I have a Guggenheim Fellowship to write a book for a more general public on populism, which of course I haven't written yet. But I have written articles. And so what I've tried to do is try to understand the rise of populism in this context. And so I think Mike is right, and we can talk about all the frustration with the lack of say that people have, and the move toward the extremes to the right and the left in response. But then the question is, why now? Why in this way? People have been very upset for a very long time. Why do we get this extreme, sort of the rise of the extremes right now? And I see it as a result of 4 basic factors, which I call the 4 M's. Remember, this is a book that needs to sell for the general public. The 4 M's are the message, the messenger, the medium, and the milieu. The message is the content is us versus them. And now it's anti-liberal democracy, anti-intermediary institutions. It's basically me, the leader, and you, the people. And the style is post-truth. It's polarizing. It's about anger and emotion. And that message works because people have indeed been frustrated for a very long time, but it needs a messenger. And that's, a charismatic messenger who's authentic. But it also requires anti-system parties, networks, et cetera. And that's all enabled by the medium of the social media, as echo chambers, as Facebook or Twitter or whatever, X, or whatever you want to call, all of that. But on top of that, it's also the traditional media that amplify those messages, especially when they're controlled by billionaires who are making money on the extremes, mainly on the right kind of message. And then finally, there's the milieu. Thank God I could find a word, another M for the milieu. And the milieu is what most social scientists talk about. It's the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind. It's the sociocultural fears of loss of status, which ends up in anti-immigration kinds of discourse, or it becomes welfare just for us. And it's also the politics of take back control, as with Brexit. But as part of that, it's also the decline of the mainstream parties that have opened a way for these extremes. And so for me, it's important to understand that politicization is not just about EU institutions or national politics, but it's also the kind of politicization that we get today with the anti-system politics, with the post-truth, with the politics. This is a technical world of bullshit and lies. And I think, and I'm going to stop here, but I sort of send it over to Mike. How do we deal with that as well? How does one, given where we've gotten, how do you come back out of that? And I'm not going to give you the answer now.
Well, just to perhaps ignite the discussion between you two, my last slide was about repoliticization. So based on what Vivien was arguing, do you think that this increasing concern at the top for political dynamics at the bottom could compensate for the lack of direct citizen involvement in the...
No. I mean, it's just a further entrenchment of a certain elite, maybe one that has learned some lessons, but not in any way democratic. I mean, let me maybe just comment on one thing. I think we have to be careful to avoid thinking that there's some sort of symmetry between extreme right and left for all sorts of reasons, but not least because if you look at the reality of what happened in the last decade in the EU, against a relatively moderate threat from the left in Greece with Syriza on an anti-austerity platform, the response was brutal. It was micromanaged. It was crushed. I mean, I know we have some Greek friends in the audience. The Greeks also had to take some blame, but compare that to the response of the EU to the far right, where it's accommodated at every turn, adopted the language of the far right. When you think about Ursula von der Leyen adopting this frame of a European way of life, Fortress Europe. Think about the deaths, thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean, as if the EU is some sort of cosmopolitan dream. The reality is that it's a very opposite. I mentioned Macron, who constantly wants to develop a more centralized, powerful executive. Probably he thinks France will hopefully be leading that, rather deluded, but has adopted a lot of the right-wing rhetoric in relation to Islamophobia, for example. So the idea that there's some symmetry, I think it has to be questioned. The pandemic, again, there of course were various phases in the pandemic, was a highly authoritarian response. Parliaments were utterly abandoned. Discussion, the democratic debate was gone. Now we can have a debate about the merits of things like lockdown and so on, but the idea that this was democratic is utterly far-fetched. Furthermore, look at what the EU was doing in relation to vaccines, in terms of largely pushed from German interest to prevent any sort of relaxation of vaccine patenting, so that the developing world could benefit from using COVID vaccines, right? This is Eurocentrism, it's not internationalism, to repeat the point of the Egyptian economist Samir Amin. So what we see developing is not in any way, shape, or form democratic. It might be that the elites have learned some managerial lessons, and that, as Vivien put it yesterday, find constantly ways to avoid the ship crashing on the rocks, but it's just leading to another set of rocks. And at some point, as I put it to her, the passengers need to actually take back control. But that wasn't exactly, I mean, I've answered your question more or less, so I'm happy to leave it at that.
Vivien, will you agree with Mike to say that the pandemic response was highly authoritarian in nature?
Yes and no. Yes, in that, when I talked about emergency politics before, what you see is that there's an assumption, there's the proportionality principle that suggests it can be legitimate to suspend democratic sort of input legitimacy and throughput procedures, so accountability, transparency, if the outcome is positive, if there's good output performance, but it has to be limited in time. I've got an article that I just read that wrote trying to talk about this. I mean, it's not ideal, obviously, but the assumption is that that you can legitimate that, and this is lots of constitutional lawyers write about this, or scholars, about the proportionality principles. Is Christian Kreuter-Sonnen, who argues this, although Jonathan White says there's no legitimation in any case. I think that you would stand with you, Mike.
Yeah.
But I kind of think in the case of that kind of an emergency, some suspension of input legitimacy, if you will, of political democratic procedures is okay, assuming that parliaments have voted to give the government emergency powers and that the governments use those appropriately. So what one could probably say is that most European governments ended up being reasonably okay on this, with the exception of Hungary and Poland, where they used it to deny women abortions. I mean, there's big gender issues on this in terms of denying women the right to go to get abortions or whatever. And also limiting freedom of the press. So that is abuse, that is exploitation of a crisis. So that is not legitimate. But in terms of lockdown measures, et cetera, one has to look at the specifics in terms of lockdown, in terms of bordering, closing borders, as well as there are lots of other measures, including vaccines. But absolutely, there's a serious problem when the EU follows German pharmaceutical companies' interests. But I'd like to get back to the sort of the populism, the extremes, the right and left, because I agree. I didn't mean to suggest that there's any kind of symmetry between the extremes of the left and the right. And Mike, you're absolutely right that the real problem in Europe and amongst European mainstream parties is essentially conservative parties, when in power, have tended to essentially let the extremes on the right set the agenda by essentially saying, okay, we have to run after on issues of immigration. We've got to run after the extreme right in order to try to keep our electors, so that the extreme right has been able to set the agenda. And that has been highly problematic. If you think about the work of Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, the whole argument is, how do you end up in fascism and authoritarianism? It's the conservatives. If they give in, if they combine, if they pick up the issues on the extreme right, thinking that way they can tame them, no, in fact, they get taken over. And we see that in play with Meloni now being the majority party in an allegedly center-right government, which is not. And so I think one has to be very careful about that. What's also interesting is if we look at Europe in particular, and you look at what happens when the extremes gain power, we see an authoritarian drift when the extremes of the right gain power. That's Kaczynski in Poland. That's Orban in Hungary. But where the left, the extreme left, which is pretty moderate in terms of, when the left gains power, often sometimes in coalition with the center left, others not, they have tended to be very respectful of liberal democracy and have been willing to give up power and have not messed with electoral systems in the same way or freedom of the media. So that in Europe, I'm not going to make a generalization about this, but in Europe, I think what you see is the extremes on the left are very different from the right, also because they tend to respect the tenets of liberal democracy in terms of separations of power, in terms of free and fair elections, et cetera, whereas the extreme right, for the most part, not in all cases, has not. I don't want to make a bigger generalization about that, because if you look at Latin America, the extremes on the left have been guilty of an authoritarian drift as much as the extremes on the right. So I'm not going to make that kind of generalization, but I think it's important to underline what Mike said about there is no symmetry between the extremes of the left and the right. And in any case, as we've seen, the real danger for Europe right now is the extremes on the right, as well as arguably the center right, in terms of the kinds of policies that we see today.
Well, Vivien, when you mentioned that the real problem is conservative parties setting the agenda, or rather co-opting the agenda of the far right, I was thinking immediately about Nicolas Sarkozy, who was one of the most prescient kind of, he felt that dynamic and he kind of ran on it a lot. But when you mentioned that the road to fascism is paved by the conservatives, actually, Mike, when you look at Weimar, we can see that the Social Democrats also had not necessarily an active role, but at least they acquiesced to the turn towards authoritarian measures. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your.
Yeah, well, no, that's a very important point. I mean, it's a complex story, and the first chapter of this book that I wrote, if you want to read it in detail. And it's hard to do justice to that I can answer certain specific points. So the German Social Democrats pursued the policy of toleration towards authoritarian liberalism, precisely because they were fearful not only of National Socialism on the horizon, but also of the Communist Party. And when Hitler, after the Nazi seizure of power, even at that moment, 1933, some on the left were saying, well, at least thank God it wasn't the communists. I mean, that's really how deep the complicity of German social democracy is with what I call authoritarian liberalism, but even more. Of course, that was before the full realization of what National Socialism would become in Germany. But the mistakes of the left are absolutely crucial to introduce into the narrative, because it's very easy to blame the conservatives. But we have to acknowledge the mistakes on the left and the center, not only in the interwar period, but I would also say fundamentally in the decades after the Second World War as well, where left actually abandons positions of revolution, of constituent power, of the idea of creating a new constitutional order and a new society, and effectively abandons, as I mentioned earlier, class struggle, abandons the classic tenets of Marxism from not only in Germany, but also the Italian Communist Party, despite, for example, it being a massive influence on Italian post-war society in a cultural way and in many other ways, was also complicit in that depoliticization, in which its position on Europe played a central role. The assumption of post-war Italian communism was that socialism could only be achieved through Europe, and that was a fatal mistake, because it led later on then to, for example, people believing in the Delors project, which was the promise of social Europe, which took in a lot of the more moderate left in the 80s and 90s. At each stage, the promise was that Europe would be more social, and it's like waiting for Godot. As we know, that never arrives. The problem in the meantime is that the right is able to benefit from all the mass Euroscepticism, the revolts. And we saw that in the last, over the last decade, the failure of the left to really galvanize the masses in ways which were at least possible in the height of the Euro crisis, when there was the potential for a mass social movement on the left to build into something bigger. Again, this faith in Europe, this misplaced faith in Europe, was to a large part catastrophic for the political strategy of the left. Yeah, in short, I agree.
And may I also add, you mentioned the abandonment of class struggle by the left post-World War II in the direct decades after the Second World War, but there was also a clear coercive turn from the Christian Democrats at the time, or at least under their aegis, because you mentioned the Karlsruhe report. It literally banned the Communist Party in 1956, right? So yeah. Can you maybe tell us about the role of these kind of institutions, judicial institutions in the reframing of the political debates, perhaps?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating story. So it's part of what I mentioned as the story that became hegemonic, that became the dominant narrative in the post-war era, was the story of militant democracy, that you need non-democratic institutions in order to secure democracy, which of course is ridiculous if you think about it for more than a few seconds, right? But this was really what people tried to push, including the Karlsruhe Accord, but under this new constitutional settlement, which the Communist Party is banned. Of course, we have to add that the extreme right party was banned as well. But this notion that you need counter-majoritarian institutions in all places in order to secure democracy became a dominant narrative. And there are, of course, again, different national stories of how this takes place. And I don't know if you want to talk more generally about the role of constitutional courts, because that's an interesting issue. I mean, the problem, of course, with Karlsruhe is then exacerbated through the process of European integration, because it gets into conflict not only with the other German bodies, the parliament and executive, but also with the European institutions. But maybe you want to come to that later. But the point about the idea that democracy is a militant democracy is, I would say, and I say this in the book, is not only a misdiagnosis of what went wrong, but it's a mislabel. It should really be named militant liberalism, because that's what it's trying to protect. And essentially a form of militant economic liberalism. It's not the political liberalism that is at the center of concern, at least with regards to the EU. I mean, there's a more complicated story around the European Convention on Human Rights, which would take us into a different dynamic. But
Vivien, what are your views on this idea of counter-majoritarian institutions trying to protect democracy? This kind of paradox that Mike is highlighting.
So before I do that, I respond to that. I want to get back to what occurs to me is that Mike and I agree and disagree in some ways, and certainly I agree on sort of the general thread of your argument about liberal authoritarianism and the way in which neoliberalism in whatever form really takes hold. Actually, for me, it takes hold later. I mean, sort of starting in the 1980s, it's more a general set of ideas and ideology, worldview, whatever we want to call it, philosophy, that slowly builds in the interwar period. And in the post-war period, you have basically it's neo-Keynesian economic policy. It's certainly not neoliberal economic policy, even as they're gathering strength because they're in Friedman, Hayek, Buchanan, you write about these and you talk about them. They're in the academy and they're training economists, but they're not in control of economic policy. That's much more post-war period is neo-Keynesian. But then with the in the 1970s, with the oil shocks, with the end of the Bretton Woods systems, et cetera, it becomes the opportune moment. And that's when you get Reagan and Thatcher with a kind of conservative neoliberalism, roll back the state. But we were talking about the left, and this gets me to the problems with the left as well, and also the EU. Mike, you seem to blame the EU for a lot of these problems, whereas I actually see it coming from national governments in European countries, in the sense that you get Reagan and Thatcher, and then Bolkestein in the Netherlands, and we can go on. All the countries, it's that you get neoliberalism at the national level in the 80s, and then you get the center left adopting it, kind of gentler neoliberalism with a sort of a social democratic overlay on neoliberalism. In the 1990s, it's Blair. You want to roll out the state to enhance the markets, and it doesn't really get to the EU until the mid or late 1990s, and that's when you begin to see much more ramp up of neoliberalism at the EU level. But you also see it internationally with the IMF, with the OECD, and all of that. So that I don't think you can blame the EU alone. It's all of it. At which point the question is, what is our answer? Do we get rid of the EU because democracy is going to grow at the national level? Or do we try to solve the problems of democracy at both the national and the EU level? And that is complicated.
Can I
Yeah,
I have to
please.
correct you on that point. The whole story of the book is precisely the opposite. It's not about blaming the EU. The EU is consolidating this this project, authoritarian liberalism. It's not the root of it. It's absolutely one of the ways in which domestic elites use to insulate themselves from popular control. So I completely agree. It's fundamentally about understanding the state. The state takes a certain shape through the project of European integration. And if you want to understand the predicament, it's absolutely vital to look at how the EU transforms the state. It's not about saying that the EU is over here and doing something bad. It's absolutely a method, a way of for domestic elites. So that's why it has to be challenged at that domestic level.
And so I would argue that, yes, it needs to be challenged at the domestic level and at the EU level, but I don't see that disbanding the EU solves any of our problems, and that maybe the EU can be the solution, assuming that you alter the way in which we think about what needs to be done at the EU level. But that also requires doing it at the national level at the same time. And in a way, I think we're in a major crisis right now with the rise of the extremes on the right. And so maybe a project of the left would be to come up with new ideas that can say, here's a new way of governing at the national level that's more democratic. And here's a way to do it at the EU level as well, which would involve much more empowerment of the European Parliament. I've talked in the past, not that anyone's listened, about sort of democratizing EU level economic governance by having macroeconomic dialogues, by having an EU, having EU permanent debt, but you can't just let the technocrats then decide this is where we're spending the money and this is how, but rather have a kind of a macroeconomic dialogue or an industrial policy dialogue that brings in all the relevant stakeholders, and we have to determine who they are, in order to discuss ways in which you can get EU level redistribution. But that, I mean, here, this may be pie in the sky, but I see national level industrial policy to address all of the challenges, as well as EU level industrial policy. And the problem that we've seen up until today is that the EU has substituted for the national level, as you argue, and then it stops the national level from doing what it wants, but it also can't do what it needs to do at the EU level. And so that there needs to be more democratization and decentralization. You know, the traditional EU word subsidiarity, there needs to be real subsidiarity, so that the national level does what is necessary, as well as the EU level. But then this does require getting rid of or rethinking things like the single market, which is definitely a neoliberal project. Level playing field, don't allow any state, but that's changed. State aid has changed as a result of the pandemic. And state aid means that the state aid rules have been suspended, and that just meant that Germany continues to spend as much as it wants, but those countries without the so-called fiscal space, meaning Southern Europe and France, because of the new, going back to the deficit and debt rules, means that they can't invest the way they need to. So all of that really needs to be rethought, and perhaps that needs to be sort of what the left then does, national. But I still see a role for the EU in this. I don't see the EU breaking up for any number of reasons, but also because, the member states, they're all really small countries in an increasingly dangerous world. We're increasing in a world where you've got the US, you've got China, you've got Russia. Geopolitically, if for no other reason, Europe needs the EU, it just needs a different EU or a new rethought EU. But I do see people, even in EU institutions, beginning to think of this way.
Mike, would you like to answer quickly, and perhaps after we will jump to the Q&A with the audience?
Oh, well, answer what?
Or if you see this as a prospect for the left, for instance, will the left need to kind of focus on the things that Vivien mentioned, on these industrial policies at the domestic level and EU level?
Not really, no. I mean, if you try and do something a number of times and you fail every time, I think you have to learn your lesson. I mean, there has to be an alternative strategy. So I don't see it as a plausible way forward.